We're on a section in my commentary called The Old Man, the New Man, and Messianic Judaism. And so we're going to read David Stern, who is a Messianic Jewish author. He wrote the Jewish New Testament commentary along with the Jewish New Testament and now the complete Jewish Bible. And so let's drop down into his comments and read these. These are taken from his Jewish New Testament commentary that I own. All right, here's what it has to say. This verse and the next speak to the issue of whether faith in Yeshua the Messiah can be combined with Judaism. And he's commenting specifically on, when he says this verse and the next, let me drop down and see. I think he's talking specifically in verse 16 and 17. He's doing what I'm doing. He's realizing that it's of those three elements, A, B, and C, right? The A being the wedding analogy, the B being the cloth analogy, and the C being the wine skin analogy. Of those three, the last two are the two that are more pointed and more relevant to kind of pushing the perspective that Yeshua is trying to reveal to his listeners. And so that's why David Stern says this verse and the next. He's talking about verse 16 and 17. These speak to whether faith in Yeshua Messiah can be combined with Judaism. Again, if you ask your average garden variety Christian commentator this question, can faith in Yeshua Messiah be combined with Judaism? I mean, in our day and age, with the cancel culture and everyone trying to be very, very careful about the words that they say, right? Because we're living in a woke generation. A lot of people might say, well, maybe it could. But the older commentaries, the farther back you go, it was, before this woke culture and cancel culture that everyone's kind of afraid to say anything, right? The Me Too movement. No one wants to say anything about someone else, or else they'll get blacklisted. But before that, just a few years ago, it was no problem. And even going years back, it was no problem for Christian commentaries basically just come right out and say, Judaism is not compatible with Christianity. Jewish worldview is essentially not able to hold the truths of Messianic lifestyle. So, David Stern says, here the old coat is Judaism, right? And the unshrunk cloth is Messianic faith, right? Christianity, which has not been adapted or shrunk to the framework of Judaism as currently practiced, right? So he's setting up his understanding, which I think is actually accurate. And we're going to read his version. We'll study his first, and then we'll drop down into Tim Haig's comments as well. But we'll start with David Stern. You have to remember, David Stern is a Messianic Jew, meaning he's a Christian who believes that Judaism is still relevant for Jews, at least. He also believes that Judaism is relevant for Christians. But first and foremost, it's relevant to Jews who want to retain a Jewish lifestyle, but also practice a faith in Jesus. This is something that's very confusing to many unbelieving Jews and confusing to many believing Gentile Christians. The idea of professing a faith in Jesus and retaining your loyalty to Torah and obedience to Torah, right? It's a strange lifestyle for both of those groups. All right, so David Stern continues. So he says shrinking here in the passage is simply an aspect of Yeshua's patch metaphor, right? Shrinking. He uses this kind of in a metaphoric way. It does not imply that Messianic faith must be diminished in order to fit into Judaism. So this is a very important point to make right away. Yeshua does say that you can't put a new patch onto an old piece of cloth without first shrinking the patch. And in the analogy, it's clear that Yeshua is referring or alluding to his own theology and his own worldview and his own perspective as that new patch. And the cloth is, in fact, and I agree with this part, the elements in the story, the analogy as they have been broken down by Christian commentaries, I agree that the cloth is the Jewish worldview or the Jewish people, or the worldview of the first century, or the mindset, and the new cloth is in fact Yeshua's messianic teaching. But Yeshua uses the verb that translates into English as unshrunk, right, or shrinking. So we don't need to take that in its literal sense that he's trying to say that my teaching needs to somehow shrink so it can fit into Judaism, as if I was the Messiah talking. Remember, Yeshua's the one who chose the words. If he wanted to use a different metaphor, he could have used any number of metaphors, but he chose the shrinking. So David Stern's just trying to alert us to the fact that don't take the metaphor too hyper literally. Typically with metaphors and similes and parables and things like that, and all these anecdotal stories, there's usually one primary main thought that's being conveyed without us needing to nitpick the parable to try and see where all of the inconsistencies lies. Don't do that, all right? I know some Christian Bible students who do that say, but what about if the parable is this? They kind of take it hyper literally, and then you lose the force of a parable. If you want to understand a parable, look for the central theme of the parable and let the other stuff be peripheral, right? It's no need to pick all the little parts pieces apart. Let's continue. David Stern says, combining unadapted Messianic faith with traditional Judaism doesn't work. Unadapted Messianic faith. What happens is the patch tears away from the coat, and he explains what he means by that. That is, faith in Yeshua apart from Judaism, and later on in the case of Gentiles, faith in Yeshua apart from the foundational truths about God that are taught in the Tanakh. This type of faith is useless and worthless. And I agree with that, all right? Faith in Yeshua, apart from the foundational truths about God taught in the Tanakh, is useless and worthless. And this, we can see, is the unfortunate path that a lot of Gentile Christians embarked upon from the early days of the formulation of the church as a group of Jews and Gentiles.